Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MZ podcast series titled COVID-19 Implications in the Eastern Mediterranean. As a brief introduction, my name is Michalis, Kontos, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Nicosia. I'm here with you on behalf of the Eastern Mediterranean Studies Initiative, alias MZ, a research initiative undertaken by the School of Law, the University of Nicosia, aiming to enhance research on issues pertinent with the Eastern Mediterranean region. We're currently running the first part of this series, and this is the second podcast of the series titled Power Games in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Future of Offshore Drilling and Trilateral Partnerships After COVID-19. The Eastern Mediterranean is a region defined broadly by energy-related affairs and also by power games that have evolved around the energy-related issues. Conflicting interests and a spiral of tit-for-tat activity is present now in the Eastern Mediterranean, visible, which recently seems to escalate significantly. Offshore drilling operations for natural gas, trilateral partnerships and their byproducts, Turkey's regional role, Greek-Turkish relations, the role of extra-regional powers are some of the topics that we will discuss today, of course, under the lens of the latest developments after the COVID-19 outbreak. I'm very pleased and proud to introduce our guests, our discussants. We're honored to have with us today Professor Tanchum. Welcome, Professor. And Dr. Angelos Syrigos. Welcome, Dr. Syrigos. Nice to see you. Let me say a few words about our guests. Professor Tanchum teaches in the International Relations Program of the Faculty of Law at the University of Navarra and is a senior fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna. He is also a fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace and the Center for Strategic Policy Implementation at Başkent University in Ankara, Turkey. Professor Tanchum is widely known for his strategic analysis of geopolitical trends in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. He is a regular contributor to Foreign Policy magazine and other policy journals. His comments have appeared in the New York Times, AIES, Deutsche Welle, as well as in news outlets in Turkey, Egypt, and the Arab Gulf states. Professor Tanchum holds a PhD from Harvard University and was a fellow at Harvard's Olins Institute for Strategic Studies and its Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. His most recent article, titled Europe, One Side of the Eastern Mediterranean Fault Lines, was published in a special report by the European Council on Foreign Affairs. Now about Dr. Angelos Syrigos. Dr. Syrigos is a member of the Greek Parliament currently with the ruling party of New Democracy, and he's also an associate professor of international law and foreign policy at Athens Panteion University. He's author of a big number of articles, academic publications, and books, including his book titled Greek-Turkish Relations, which was published by AIES Publishing House in 2015, and it is considered to be one of the top Greek readings on the topics. Now, my dear guests, I am ready now to start our discussion, and I would start with Professor Tanchum. Professor, I would like to hear your estimation and your analysis regarding how do you expect that COVID-19 outbreak will affect or already does affect economic and political dynamics in the broader Eastern Mediterranean, both at the state level as well as at the systemic level.
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to appear on this podcast with my distinguished colleague, Dr. Syrigos. And thank you to MC, and I wish MC great success in what it's trying to do. I look at COVID-19 as a geopolitical stress test. A stress test in English is where they put those meters on your body and they make you go on a treadmill in case you might not realize you possibly could have a heart attack or a stroke. Maybe you have some high blood pressure or cholesterol. So it reveals that. Truths that are uncomfortable for a person. Well, COVID-19 revealed truths that were uncomfortable for the European Union and European countries as a whole. So I'm going to start with that and then drill down to the Eastern Mediterranean very quickly. What it revealed is Europe cannot deal with large-scale and systemic crises. If you think about it, the European Union was created to prevent war among European states. And COVID-19 really was the first European scale warlike situation that the EU 20 plus has faced. I mean, you could talk about a breakup of Yugoslavia or even global jihadism, but this was really the first large scale systemic crisis with an opponent, an adversary who's not conscious, a virus. And it was a total performance failure on the European part. No European-wide medical information, coordinated policy, no policy towards China. So what we see is Europe cannot deal with large-scale systemic crises. And what I argue now, what we're moving into is a large-scale systemic crisis in the Mediterranean. Not just the Eastern Mediterranean, but now we see it's integrated into the whole Mediterranean. And we have the agendas of the entire Middle East driving this, with the rivalry between Turkey being affected, with the rivalry with the UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, all now in the Mediterranean. And then of course, individual European countries also discovered they can't deal with systemic crises either. The other main factor is the economic contraction. Well, you see, Greece is going to be over 10%, Italy 10%, 11%, France 8%, Spain 9%. All the major countries of the Southern Mediterranean, of the Med-7, will barely have enough resources just to service their debt. The same thing here is that, you have a credit card. If you can't pay it back at the end of the month, the whole thing, you have to pay the partial payment. Well, countries have to do the same, except that all the countries of the Southern Mediterranean are either close to 100% or over 100%. So if the economy shrinks, the first thing they have to do is make sure that money goes to debt servicing, and then, of course, reviving their economies. How can they confront situations in the Mediterranean? And if their economies shrink, all the other countries on the other side of the Mediterranean, who are the main, where Europe is their main export markets, go into deep economic crisis. So the situation is very serious, and that creates opportunities for Russia and China and Turkey. Turkey, to my mind, is one of the big winners of COVID-19, as long as they get, they're supplied with foreign currency reserves by international actors. Their economy is not going to shrink, and they have first mover advantage in Libya. And we've seen that. Libya did not take a break for COVID-19. That's part of the advantage of drones. Drones are pilotless, and you can run them when and not be affected. So Libya did not take a break for COVID-19, and Turkey gained tremendous advantage, which is going to revolutionize, and already is starting to revolutionize, the strategic relations in the entire Mediterranean. And so now we find that Russia and Turkey are the agenda setters, and this has put the European powers on their heels, and the US foreign policy is still very confused. So that's a summary of where we are. And And then, of course, everything concerning Eastern Mediterranean gas has been put on hold because the gas demand is down. Development of, as you well know, in Cyprus has been put on hold. Noble has put Aphrodite on hold. Lebanon canceled its second round, or the follow-up on its second round for licensing. Zor has been affected, has a manpower shortage even in Egypt. So everything is kind of on hold, which on the other hand can create an opportunity for a reset, in my opinion. That's the one upside. But I think what this pace of events with Egypt mobilizing troops now on the border as we're speaking has shifted the focus. And part of what the Eastern Med countries have to worry about is the agenda of the Eastern Mediterranean is rapidly getting out of Eastern Mediterranean hands. That has been the danger of these alliances. And as we see that Libya's fate is being decided by everybody but the Libyans, I think people in the Eastern Mediterranean have to worry that if we don't take care of our backyard, then other powers are going to decide the fate for us. So I'll leave it there. Obviously, there are a lot more details to fill in, but as an opening, setting the table, that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanchum. You gave us a lot of opportunities for discussion in a lot of topics that I intended anyway to bring to the fore in this discussion. One additional topic that maybe you would like to comment. How about the collapse of oil prices? How do you see it playing out in relation with the natural gas prices and the perspective of the region regarding natural gas?
First of all, the collapse of oil prices makes Saudi Arabia the big winner, which has consequences for the Eastern Med, because Saudi Arabia's role as the central banker of oil was confirmed. Saudi Arabia is the only country that has enough reserve capacity to take on and off the market. So when they needed to restore oil prices, everybody turned to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh. So even in Washington, Riyadh's credibility is up despite the Khashoggi murder. So what that means, it translates into more Saudi leverage with Egypt and can leverage in that way versus Turkey and Libya. Also, oil demand will go back up, but the only country that will be able to take advantage of it quickly will be Saudi Arabia. When the demand goes up, only Saudi Arabia will be able to fulfill that. Also, countries with old fields, if they try to restart, they could actually damage them. There are certain countries that have lost capacity. For those countries where their gas contracts are indexed to oil, obviously they're affected by these fluctuations. I think the COVID-19 and the oil war just accelerated a trend that was already happening, that the dominant form of traded gas will be LNG. So I don't think the East Med pipeline was ever a real economic contender. That's been my opinion. But certainly now in this environment, it's not. And West Med gas revives, it will be LNG. You even see now Italy just brought a small scale LNG facility online. Turkey, for example, had its high strategic vulnerability that it receives 60 to 70% of its gas from Russia and Iran. Totally reduce that. How? LNG. Where do they get the LNG from? Obviously, the close ally Qatar, but LNG imports to Turkey from the United States, from Louisiana, have risen by 300%, almost from 0 to 300%, which also has consequences for the US position vis-a-vis the Eastern Mediterranean and the Libyan conflict. So in that sense, Algeria is problematic, will lose out, and that makes Algeria more vulnerable to either pressure from Turkey or Russia, which is a factor also as the conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean have become Mediterranean-wide conflicts. So in that sense, pipeline projects, I don't see them coming back on. And the politics around pipelines are really a charade. But LNG will be more important. So that means Idku and Damietta, their significance will even be greater.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Dr. Syrigos, I'm coming to you now. Of course, you're free to comment what Professor Tanchum said, but my question to you now is regarding the so-called trilateral partnerships that Greece has formed along with Cyprus and Israel on the one hand, and along with Cyprus and Egypt on the other hand. How do you see them evolve after the COVID-19 outbreak? And of course, how do you see their byproducts developing? Professor Tanchum already made a statement about the EastMed pipeline. What's your view about this, the EastMed pipeline or the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which are byproducts of the trilateral partnerships?
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you, the University of Nicosia, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean Studies Initiative, for giving me the opportunity to discuss the situation and the power games in the Eastern Mediterranean with Professor Michael Tanchum and, of course, Dr. Michalis Kontos. Now, two short comments about the situation of COVID-19 and the world. It is not only the European Union that did not manage to face the crisis with COVID-19. In reality, after the Second World War, the real world crisis was COVID-19, and the Security Council, the UN Security Council, did not manage to issue a single resolution on this issue. It is very interesting. The reason was that there were different ideas of the big five states participating there, and the role of China in relation to COVID-19 and the World Health Organization and all these things. But it is interesting that Security Council did not manage to issue a single resolution. Now, that's the first comment. The second comment has to do with the fact that hydrocarbons prices have fallen in general. That means that big companies like Total, Eni, do not want to continue their projects in the Eastern Mediterranean. The best example is what is happening south of Cyprus in the Cypriot EEZ. On the contrary, Turkey is not affected by this situation for a very simple reason. Turkey, during the last 9 years, decided to create its own fleet of seismographic and drilling vessels. So it is not economy that directs these ships to go and drill or make research in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the decision, it's a political decision.
Yes.
So Turkey can go and continue make research or drilling, search or drilling in the area, whereas the big companies which worked on this field have stopped. Now, about your question, we have before 2010, Greece relied almost exclusively on NATO and the European Union on its policy in the whole region. it is obvious that neither NATO nor the European Union are able to assist Greece on the issues of the Eastern Mediterranean. In 2010, Israel, not Greece, Israel, decided to create this axis of states, Israel, Cyprus, Greece. And then it was followed by the axis between Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. Nevertheless, these trilateral meetings do not, well, they very well until now, but they miss the strategic depth needed for all the partners in this area. And when I mean strategic depth, I mean security. If you have the security issue in these meetings, then you have roots in your strategic relationship. If you do not have security, then something else can happen in the near future and lose this strategic alliance with these two states, with Israel and Egypt. I'm speaking about Greece and Cyprus. How this was affected by COVID-19? Well, the good thing is that Israel now has a government with whom you can negotiate with. I'm saying this because before March, we didn't have, well, we have continuous elections in Israel. Of course, the government in Israel is not the result of COVID-19, but it happened during this crisis. And it is interesting that the first trip of the Greek Prime Minister, after the end of, well, not the end, anyway, during this period was
the lockdown.
Yes, the slowdown. Hope so. Hope so, because I was just reading the news. Until now, we had 10 incidents.
No.
Do you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course, of course.
Okay. Until now, we had 10 or 12 incidents. I think that Professor Tanchum has a problem to hear us.
Professor Tanchum, do you hear us? Maybe he.
Audio.
We hear you. Maybe we could help Professor Tanchum from our technical support in order to restore his audio connection. Maybe by logging out and then logging in again. Until the restoration of Professor Tanchum's connection, I think we can continue,
Okay.
Dr. Syrigos.
Okay. What I was saying was that the first trip of the Greek Prime Minister was in Israel. It is a clear sign that Greece believes in the continuation of these trilateral meetings, and if it is possible to deepen the strategic partnership. Now, about the situation in Egypt. The Greek Foreign Minister, Mr. Dendias, visited Egypt a few days ago. Egypt has a real problem with the situation in Libya. Actually, not Egypt. President Sisi has a problem with the situation in Libya. Yeah. If Sarraj manages to control the whole of Libya, then Egypt will face the situation of having a country run by a Muslim Brotherhood next to its borders and assisting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So I can say that this is an existential threat for Libya. That's for Egypt. For Egypt. From the other point of view, what is happening in Libya is very important for the European Union as well. It's a pity that Professor Tanchum cannot hear this point, because what is happening in Libya is the creation of an Islamic state next to Europe, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, whereas the existence of the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, somewhere in the desert between Syria and Iraq, was to a certain extent irrelevant for everyday business in Europe, with the exception of foreign fighters returning back from these areas back to Europe. If we have an Islamic State south of Europe, in Libya, having common borders, common frontiers with Greece, Italy, and Malta, and very close to France, it is not an existential threat, it is a systemic threat for Europe.
Yeah. Of course, Libya and developments there is one of our central topics in this discussion, and we will get back to it. I would like to ask you regarding regarding Turkey's advantage after COVID-19, due to the fact that, as you said, when it comes to drilling operations offshore Cyprus, it's private companies that are involved, and they decided to postpone their operations due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And Turkey continues because it is acting as a state actor. It has the ownership of the drilling ships. Do you think that there is a possibility that Turkey may turn the game around, in the sense that maybe Turkey will change the viewpoints of other actors, like companies or other countries, regarding the state of affairs in the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially regarding the delimitation agreements achieved by Cyprus with Egypt and with Israel, respectively?
Okay. I'm trying quite often to understand what is the view of Erdogan, of President Erdogan.
Hello.
Okay. Can
Nice
you
We
hear
hear
us?
you. Welcome
Nice
back.
to see you.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Quite often I'm trying to understand what is the view of President Erdogan towards recent developments in the whole area. If we see what happened during the last 1 year, we can see the following. Turkey made 5 drillings in the exclusive economic zone of another state, Cyprus.
Right.
In practice, there was no reaction. There was no real reaction.
From whom?
Either by Cyprus or by the companies which are involved in blocks where Turkey made the drillings. Because 2 of the drillings took place in 2 blocks which were given to Eni and Total.
7 and 8.
I'm familiar with the map. Yes.
Secondly, Turkey, during this period, Turkey entered the territory of another state, of 2 other states, of Syria in October 2019 and of Iraq a few days ago. And the reaction of Russia and the United States was, to a certain extent, to reward Turkey for what they did. They signed an agreement with them on the issue. Thirdly, Turkey violates all Security Council resolutions regarding Libya and managed to change the balance in favor of Sarraj. Sarraj, by the end of November, was isolated in the city center of Tripoli, with Haftar forces just 7 kilometers away from the city center. Today, Sarraj controls the whole western Libya, and its forces are very close to attack the port of Sirte in central Libya.
Yes.
Although we have this change of balance, the balance of powers changed completely, in reality, there was no strong reaction against Turkey of what they did. Furthermore, in November last year, we had an agreement. It was called Memorandum of Understanding between Libya and Turkey, which was not only against international law of the sea. Why it was against international law of the sea? Because international law provides that states which have opposite or adjacent coasts can sign an agreement. In the case of Libya and Turkey, there are no opposite coasts or adjacent coasts between the two states. The opposite coasts are the coasts of the Greek islands and Greek mainland. Nevertheless, they signed an agreement which is against international law and against geography in practice. But here we go, the situation, nobody was really annoyed about this. The European Union issued certain statements on the issue. 5 states of the area issued certain statements of the issue, but that was it. So, from the Turkish point of view, if Turkey violates international law, they do not have, either they do not have reactions, as real reactions, or sanctions, or they are rewarded as in the case of Syria. And we have another incident which is extremely important because it gives a totally different view of Turkey. This is what happened in the Greek-Turkish borders in late February, early March this year. What was interesting during this period was that Turkey decided to send to Greece a vast number of migrants and refugees. They were, of course, unarmed, and they tried to enter Greece violating the Greek borders there. Many people thought that this was a new 2015. It was the 2015 migration crisis that shook Europe by that time. But this is not a new 2015. It was an exceptional case in international law where humanitarian laws and asylum procedures were used as a means to destabilize the political system of Greece. You see, until now, the problems between Greece and Turkey had to do with sovereignty, sovereign rights, discussions about maritime zones. During the first days of March, Turkey tried to put to Greece, in Greek territory, 40 or 50,000 migrants and refugees. This would have created a major issue for the new Greek government, which was elected with the idea that we are going to protect the borders. So in reality, they tried to destabilize politically Greece and use this as a tool, as a message to the rest of Europe. Look what we can do with the vast number of refugees and migrants who live in our country. If we open the gates, we are going to destabilize you the same way we destabilized Greece. As I used to say to my students, it is a totally different issue to claim that an islet off the island of Crete is not Greek, and another issue is to try to get rid of the mayor of Crete. So we have these problems with Turkey recently.
Yeah.
It shows that they run against the basic idea of international relations and peaceful solutions, etc. All these things that we are teaching to the students.
We will definitely get back to Greek-Turkish relations because, in my point of view, that's the probably the most dangerous flashpoint right now in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the possibility of a conflict between these two countries, and that would entail a lot of ramifications. So I will get back to this. I was notified that we have 10 more minutes if it's okay with us, because of the problem that we had. So Professor Tanchum, Dr. Syrigos referred to Libya before, saying that there is a systemic threat for Europe due to the fact that if the government of Mr. Sarraj prevails with the help of Turkey, of course, in this internal conflict, it means that there's going to be an Islamic state so close to Europe, as well as an existential threat for Egypt, which is considered to be, and this is my addition, a pillar of stability in the broader area. What would you add to this statement?
Yeah, I would add a lot, actually. I think there's many more dimensions to this. I don't know if I'd agree with you about the Islamic State. I'd be very careful of what terminology I would use. But the fact is, Turkey will transform its geostrategic position throughout the Mediterranean, because it will have an air base in Wathiya, and it will have a naval base in Misrata. It will not only, you brought up the issue of migration, not only dominate the eastern migration route, it will dominate the migration route in central Mediterranean. It will also the pipelines, the Green Stream, trade. It also now is increasing Turkey's clout in Tunisia and Algeria, which I already mentioned are very vulnerable. So there's without Europe stepping in a big way, these countries will either fall more under the influence of Turkey or more under the influence of Russia. Turkey then can penetrate further with its economic and soft power relations in the whole.
I think we
vis-a-vis Europe. Turkey broke out of its isolation. But what I'd like to say.
One moment. We didn't hear you.
We lost you for 2 or 3 seconds.
Oh, I say, so Turkey broke out of its isolation. Again, I've said Turkey is the big winner with this. Look, France did everything covertly. Russia covertly. UAE financed covertly. Turkey made an overt alliance with what it calls, and many people, the UN recognized government. What's legal and what's not legal and what's international law looks different from Turkey's perspective. Turkey feels it's unfairly isolated. It's trying to be contained in the Eastern Mediterranean. It also feels like it has been totally excluded from the marketing of Eastern Mediterranean gas. I won't go into all the details. So its breakout moment was in Libya, and it's paid off big time. But it also reflects the failures of European policy, Italian policy, French policy. If you go back to Turkey made its agreement with the GNA in 2019, November, exactly 1 year after the Palermo conference, right, which held in Italy, where Turkey was excluded from the meeting between Haftar and Sarraj. Turkey stormed out. Fuat Oktay, the vice president, made a great speech, a big speech in North Cyprus. He said, you're going to see our righteous stand in Syria, in Cyprus, and in Libya. And that's exactly what the Turks have done. Now, so this is where Libya becomes very important and becomes important for Greece. I'd like to pick up on a very important point Dr. Syrigos mentioned, and that is in the trilateral alliances, the lack of real strategic coordination. Now, that could be overstated. I mean, Israel and Greece participate together in the Anochios joint exercise. Egypt and Greece have the Medusa exercises. But right now, Egypt cannot stand up to Turkey in Libya if it's an all-out war. Egypt, first of all, just wants a buffer zone. They didn't support Haftar going all the way to Tripoli. They just want a buffer zone in eastern Libya, so they're willing to go across the border. But this is where the rubber meets the road. If Turkey really tries to push to get the oil crescent and to get Derna, because that agreement that they made with the GNA, the landfall on the other side, whether you think it's legal, illegal, I understand UNCLOS Article 121, I know the law, but the landfall on the Libyan side is Derna. Derna is now under GNA control. Also, as you mentioned, Islamists, they want to get back to Benghazi. They were kicked out. So I think it's going to be very hard. Turkey is going to have to make a choice whether it's going to take half of Libya or not. But if it comes to a big confrontation, right, Egypt cannot take on Turkey without the support of the Hellenic Navy. So in a worst case scenario, which I hope we don't get close to this, it's already terrible policy failures that we've gotten this far. But where the rubber is going to meet the road in this worst case scenario, if Egypt and Turkey really have a massive confrontation, what is the Hellenic Navy going to do? Is it going to support Egypt or not? And I think that becomes a very critical decision for Greece, especially given all the vulnerability Greece has in the Aegean. And so the fact that we're coming to like a spiral of escalation, it just shows a policy failure on the part of the EU, in my opinion, especially the Med-7 countries. But I think this is where, in talking about Greece, the Greece-Egypt relationship is really coming to the foreground and part of the strategic calculus. I could talk more about France, the US, and Russia, but I'd like to give
Thank you very much.
our colleague to respond. Yes.
We have some questions from the audience on this topic, so we will get back for the last 10 minutes of our discussion. Right. Dr. Syrigos, let us focus now with you on Greek-Turkish relations, and the framework has already been described both by you and by Professor Tanchum. Would you say that a serious military incident between Greece and Turkey is now more likely than ever?
Well, this is something we live with since 1974. In theory, we expect this to happen. 3 times in the past, we almost reached this point of a full-scale war. In 1977, in 1980, in 1976, in 1987, and in 1996. It is true that since Erdogan came to power, the situation was it was not so dangerous. We didn't have so many incidents. Nevertheless, we had serious incidents, but we were not at the brink of a war as we were in the past. A very short comment about what Professor Tanchum said. The Egyptian Navy has some ships which are really very modern, and they have passed through a modernization project. For example, they have 2 landing helicopters of Mistral class. They have Oliver Hazard Perry frigates. They have Frem frigates, Knox class frigates. The situation of their navy is very good in general. I think that as it concerns big ships, they are in a very good, they're very well positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's my view. If Greece is involved in this situation, if there is a war in Libya, the only thing that affects really Greece is the fact that all these ships, all warplanes, everything has to pass from Greek airspace. That's the main thing. I'm speaking and at the same time I'm watching out of the window because there is an extremely heavy rain now in Athens. It is unbelievable what is happening outside of my window.
A summer storm. Yeah.
Yes. Now, since we discussed about COVID-19 and the effects that it had on the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, it is very interesting that yesterday it was revealed that Sarraj's government gave $12 billion to Turkey as payment for Turkey's involvement in Libya. And this is an explanation of the thousands of mercenaries from Syria, of the sophisticated troops, drones, of the tanks that were sent to Libya. It gives a very good reason. Well, Turkey wanted to get involved in Libya in any case, but it is paid for that reason by Sarraj's government. And I believe that this is very important, that since yesterday we have a figure of the cost of this Turkish involvement. According to the report, Sarraj's government deposited $4 billion in the Central Bank of Turkey, and another $8 billion were later deposited to pay for Turkey's military intervention in Libya.
And I think, you know, that's a bit of a interpretation. I mean, on the technical grounds, it's Libya paying back part of the debt it owed to Turkey for projects prior to 2011. I understand, meaning prior to the fall of Gaddafi, where there were many Turkish construction projects, and according to Turkey, the debt owed to them is much higher than that, than the 12 billion. But I understand your point and how it's taken, especially Turkey has such a shortfall in foreign reserves. Turkey actually could not do anything if it was not helped with its foreign reserve problem, which really brings in the issue of what foreign powers will do and how much they will let Turkey pursue its interests. In that case, I think what you have is a big problem where, you know, part of the United States government is concerned about Russia's presence in Libya, right? From the point of view of AFRICOM or the U.S. Defense Department, Russia's presence in Libya is a much greater problem than Turkey's presence, whereas the Democrats in the U.S. Congress might look at it the other way. For them, Turkey is a problem, but that's U.S. politics, and that will also depend on what happens in the November election.
Yeah.
That's, I think, too much afield. Yes.
I add something on this.
Yes, Dr. Syrigos, yes.
Well, the situation of the United States resembles to a certain extent of the vacuum that existed in US foreign policy in June and in July and August 1974, when the Watergate scandal came to the surface, and it was the period of Turkey's intervention in Cyprus and the occupation of the island. So I have the impression that during the next months until November, until the US elections in November, are going to be critical, because Turkey may try to take advantage of the fact that the US government and the US system is turning inside and looks of the events in the country without having an international presence. And about Russia, it is interesting that Russian troops, Wagner, decided to leave Western Libya without fighting with the Syrian mercenaries and Turkish troops a few weeks ago. If we read carefully what Russia says since November last year, I remind to our audience that in November, Haftar almost won the war against Saras. He was very close to Tripoli.
But I disagree with that characterization. He took over 3/4 of Libya, but he didn't conquer anything. That quick, where you saw 3/4 of Libya filled up in red on the map under Haftar is because he made deals with various tribes and various militias. When it came down to actually fighting pitched battles, I take Benghazi as an example. It took Haftar 3 years to get ISIS and other jihadists out. So I think that's illusionary that he ever was really going to take Tripoli and defeat only I think, and with Wagner, again, first of all, Wagner is not the only Russian private military company. You have about 4 of them. And just because Wagner is there or these other PMCs are there, doesn't mean it's Russia doing it. They will not do anything Russia doesn't want them to do. But it's not necessarily Russia who's paying their bills.
No, they don't.
Yes,
Right.
Doctor, let's give the floor again to Dr. Syrigos to
Yeah,
complete
please go
wrap
ahead.
up his talk.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I believe that if we read carefully what Russia said since November, they didn't say we want a government with run by Haftar. We want a government by all parties where Haftar is going to be the main party, but we want all of them participate in this. And I strongly believe that Russia did not want Haftar to win, to be the absolute winner, because they didn't trust him. And they believed that if Haftar won, he could have an arrangement with the United States very, very soon. So they want to find a solution with Turkey for 3 reasons. One, Turkey does not have is not as powerful as Russia is. 2, Turkey is dependent by Russia in the Syrian front. 3, Russia wants to create problems to NATO through this partnership with Turkey. So they want to have a negotiation and a solution with Turkey, not with others on
I would agree with many of those points. I would also like to add that Russia's presence in Libya is very thin. So Russia got, compared to Syria, where they have a naval base and an air base. So the fact that by the time you get to the Berlin conference, Russia and Turkey are the agenda setters, like they're going to have an Astana process for Libya, that's a big win because Russia got a big standing for very little commitment. So they became the big players without really having a lot committed. When you look at Russia's commitment to Syria, it's nowhere near the commitment that they have in Libya. I also agree with you. Russia has been looking for several years for the post-Haftar scenario. And I think what you raise is an interesting symbiosis ultimately. For Turkey, having the Russian boogeyman in Libya is good because then they could say to the US, see, we will act as the counterbalance to Russia. So there is a certain kind of symbiosis. Similarly, I think Russia would prefer to divide up Libya with Turkey than to have to deal with a different situation. And as you said, one of Russia's main goals is to divide the European Union and to divide NATO. And the Libyan policy is just another example of Russia playing a weak hand very wisely. And but this is where we have to put the responsibility on Greece, on Italy in particular, on France in particular, and on Germany for failing to craft coherent and good policy on Libya, particularly France. I'm really speaking about France, Italy, and Germany. I would also say Spain should be a voice in that discussion as well, since they have so much at stake. But so you can't, I mean, in this sense, this is Europe's failure. Libya is Europe's border, southern border.
If I may, because we have about 5 minutes,
Sure.
and we had some questions, but your conversation answered most of them. So I have chosen 2 of the questions that we got that I would like to make one to each one of you, starting with Professor Tanchum and taking from where you left it, Professor, regarding France. What are the stakes of France? A question from our audience says, in this region.
Oh, thank you for asking. But at the end of this week, I'm publishing an
Just
article on that.
A little bit short answer.
Yeah, very short.
About 2 minutes.
France's stakes are extremely high. They're in a systemic rivalry with Turkey throughout Africa and the Middle East. Don't forget, France is closely aligned with the United Arab Emirates. They have a base in the United Arab Emirates. So their rivalry goes across a vast amount of territory, and they perceive Turkey as pushing on their territory and threatening their influence, not only in North Africa, the Maghreb, but also in West Africa, Central Africa, and the Sahel. They see something very big at stake. And that's why France is very amenable to Russia. And, you know, so where France is not so worried about NATO's Eastern Front, the way Poland or Romania would be, they're concerned about the threats they see in the Southern Front of Europe and NATO. And for them, you know, in this case, Turkey is more of a liability than an asset.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Dr. Syrigos, one last question for you, again, of this expected length, about 2 minutes, regarding the failure of a delimitation agreement between Greece and Egypt so far. Would you see a possibility from Greece to make concessions towards Egypt regarding, for example, Castellorizo or Crete, when it comes to the delimitation of their common part of their exclusive economic zones, and whether this would cause domestic reactions in Greece?
There are 2 issues regarding delimitation with Egypt. The first is the extent of the delimitation line, whether it will cover the whole area from Crete, the island of Crete, to the island of Castellorizo, which according to Greece has a continental shelf. The second has to do with the influence of the islands in the median line. We are speaking about the island of Crete, which is the 5th largest island of the Mediterranean Sea, and the island of Rhodes, which is the 9th largest island of the Mediterranean Sea. It is very difficult to speak about concessions, almost impossible to speak about concessions in the influence of islands on the median line.
Especially populated islands, big ones?
When I say 5th and 9th, it is both as it concerns its size as well as its population.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting discussion that got so deep into so many topics pertinent with Eastern Mediterranean politics. Myself, I didn't expect that we could open so many windows and go so deep in each one of them. Thank you so much for your contribution, and I really hope that we will have the opportunity to repeat this discussion in the future.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attendance, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just make reference to our next podcast, our next episode, which will take place after 2 days, June 24th at 6 o'clock. And the title is Migration in the Eastern Mediterranean and COVID-19. Thank you very much.